Welcome everyone, welcome dear audience, whether you're at the cinema or in front of the screen, to this year's Human Rights Film Festival. This year we run the festival throughout the whole year, focusing on a number of selected UN days. And today we're celebrating and highlighting the International Day of Cultural Diversity and Dialogue. And we hope that you have all had the opportunity to see the thought-provoking and beautiful documentary Honeyland by Tamara Kotevska and Ljubomir Stefanov. And today we will discuss some important, interesting topics: biodiversity, cultural diversity, and biocultural diversity. And with us today in the studio, we have some very knowledgeable people, Alejandro, Claudia, and Pernilla. Starting with you, Alejandro Fuentes, you're a senior researcher here at the RWI, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. You have a PhD in international human rights law. You have a law degree as well, and you have studied both in Cordova and in Italy, Trento University. And your research focuses on international human rights law, in particular on international regional systems of human rights protection, cultural diversity, and identity. You're also very focused on minority and indigenous peoples' rights, and you also educate and teach a lot within the human rights education. And Claudia, Dr. Ituarte Lima, you're also a senior researcher. You're an affiliate researcher here at the RWI, but you're also a researcher at the Swedish, I have to look at my little note here, Stockholm Resilience Center. You hold a PhD from the University College London. You have a degree in philosophy as well. And you are specialized in the nexus between human rights, biodiversity, and climate law, both in theory and in practice. You're also a research associate at the University of British Columbia. Furthermore, you act as an expert advisor for the Convention on Biological Diversity and to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. And Pernilla Malmer, last but not least, you're a senior advisor at SwedBio, a CEDA-supported program on biodiversity and resilience at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And you work with indigenous peoples and local communities' knowledge, innovation, practices regarding biodiversity governance. And you're also very interested in their related rights and their land and to self-determination. Your work relates to local and global policy processes, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Claudia and Pernilla, you know each other from before, I know. And so we have met before, and we're extremely happy that you're here to talk to us about these exciting and very trending topics. Mr. Fuentes, I'm happy to introduce, to let you start the discussion. Sorry, Alejandro Fuentes, it happens to the best, but I have to ask you to unmute.
Yes, that's even though we live in Zoom, there is always that we forget something. So I just said, thank you, Stina, for not only introduce us, but also for generate this opportunity to meet and discuss about these very important topics. And thanks to the organizers to give us the chance not only to watch a marvelous film, but also to reflect and discuss upon the lessons learned that this film could give to us. So I think if we think about the film, what of the main elements that I can take, besides the wonderful landscapes that really make us want to visit these wonderful places that in which the film has been broadcasted, it called my attention the absence of the state. And that's something that we need to reflect upon, especially from the human rights perspective. Here at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, where I work, we pay a lot of attention on the obligation of state in respecting, promoting, and fulfilling the rights that the international community has identified as essential, as fundamental for all human beings. And here we found individuals trying to develop their life using the knowledge and the understanding that they have coming from different cultural backgrounds and approaching nature and the environment in different ways, and entering into conflict toward each other. And the state is not there in order to mediate those conflicts, in order to make sure that the rights of the individuals do not affect the rights of others, to making sure that everybody could enjoy, to take part in cultural life, to enjoy the connection with a healthy environment, and to develop their life in sustainability and in dignity. So this was the first element that captured my attention, the absence of the state. In a place where the state is not present, of course, then the dynamics turn into more to the state of nature, where those that has the forces in their hands could impose their conditions. With these initial reflections, I would like to hear more the reflections from the side of Pernilla, and in particularly in connection with the view that they see, her views in connection with these systems of production that comes with the indigenous minorities, close connections with the land, and the way that they struggle to maintain and sustainable develop their own understanding, their own knowledge, their own way to relate with the nature. How do we can protect that and make sure that this incredible piece of knowledge, this incredible piece of human culture is not lost in a transformation toward a more mechanized world? Pernilla, what are your first reflections regarding the movie and the dynamics behind it? Pernilla, you are mute, I'm afraid. It happened to us,
thank
don't worry.
Yeah, thank you so much. My first reflection is that, as you say, it's an amazingly beautiful movie, and it contains so much of both, I mean, the interplay between human culture and nature. What is also very clear is that we are entering at the time when many of the inhabitants that have been living in this village have disappeared. I mean, Hayitchas, she's kind of the last beekeeper in a long tradition, or wild honey collector in a long tradition. I mean, this kind of traditions you can find in many parts of the world, but it's obvious that it's an example of knowledge, culture, knowledge, values that is getting lost, which has to do both with our knowledge on biodiversity, but also the culture that have been adapting to it. And of course, if all this community where we don't know why they have been leaving, how it happened that the Macedonian community is now just her and her mother living there. I can imagine that this meeting have been quite different, because you can also see that the newcomers, some family have much less knowledge about both this landscape and the bees, but they have also quite different values. And you can also see the pressure from the income. But if you look at, take it at the international law perspective, you can also very clearly see that, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, recognize indigenous peoples and local communities, traditional knowledge, innovation and practices, and their values. And what is most important for maintaining this is the right to land. And if we look at this state that is present, I just wonder where is her right to her land, where is her right to resources? And of course, this is something that, as you say, the state is not there, and somewhere there must be a system which we don't know from this, and it leaves them very alone in a fight between different cultures, where she has much more of this meeting of values for nature, where humans take care of nature, but also can harvest at the same time.
That's I really appreciate that you're putting all of these different interests that are at stake that could clash, and if the state is not there in order to protect the access to individuals to their lands as their traditional lands and traditional resources, in order to guarantee the sustainable development of those traditional practices, then of course they are alone in order to defend themselves. And here is where individuals need to face injustice. In a sense, if justice is not provided to them by reinforcing their rights, then they will face injustice. And to this sense, I think I would like to call Claudia to the discussion, because she has been writing a lot about environmental justice. So not only justice perspective from the individuals, from the individual right perspective, but also in connection with the environment, a justice that is respectful from for the environment and nature, and retrofit that respect between humans and nature. So Claudia, what was your first impression regarding the film when you approach it from your own disciplinary perspective, your own lenses?
Thank you, Alejandra and Pernilla, for a very thoughtful initial discussion. So I think something that it's important to keep in mind is that we all depend on healthy ecosystems, which are underpinned by biodiversity. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, all depend on a healthy environment. Yet this is not just a legal abstract or scientific abstract construction. It's very much grounded in particular contexts, in particular cultural understandings of the world. And here, I mean, what we see is more explicit, this provisioning nature contributions to people in terms of the honey. But I think what the film really shows is this interconnection between also these cultural nature contributions to people. Some of the understanding that at some point in the film, it's mentioned that the village without a river is not a village. So we see the connection also there with water. Then the understanding that if you burn the grass, it's not only going to affect people, but also it's the food for the bees. So this ecosystems approach, although they are not using this word, it is a clear understanding of these interconnections. And on the question that you raised, Alejandro, in terms of the function of the state and the human rights obligation towards different groups, and I would add heightened obligations towards people in vulnerable situations, which includes traditional communities. I think that's extremely important. And I think here the notion of the right to a healthy environment, that it's recognized very widely in different constitutions, secondary laws, regional instruments, it is also very helpful. In the sense that, again, it provides us an understanding between the connections of substantive elements, including the element of healthy and sustainable produced food, and other procedural elements, information, public participation. And here I would like to ask you just to, perhaps as a lawyer, and I'm trained as a lawyer, we're very much focusing on the roles of the state. I could ask you to also kind of put an emphasis on the dignity and the empowered individuals, the right holders. So when we're talking about information as part of this element of the right to a healthy environment, not only think of what the state is doing, but also the very valuable information that people are generating, that people can be sharing in terms of this knowledge about beekeeping, but also about the rules, the customary norms that make this diversity happen And here I'm thinking of when it's mentioned, well, half for the bees and half for us. And I think that is important also in the sense that people are participating to safeguard nature without necessarily the state being there. So here, I think we have a lot to learn in terms of, for example, biocultural community protocols. That is not necessarily the state telling the people what to do, but a more bottom-up approach of what are these customary norms that allows us to be in harmony with nature. And I would like to provide at some point other examples of other parts of the world that relate to this topic and how this has been implemented in practice, just to think also how we put this in a broader perspective. But for now, I'd like to pass you over, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And I think it's very important what you are highlighted, a bottom-up approach. So let the voices of the communities that are forgotten to be heard. But here we found that the community is shrinking because has been left behind to a certain extent. And the representative of that community, that is just only two representatives, our main character of the movie, Hatitze and her mother, are left alone facing the interaction with the newcomers that represent a different culture. So talking about cultural diversity, the International Declaration of Cultural Diversity, the Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity by UNESCO 2001, if I remember correctly, recognized the unique value of all cultures. So the newcomers also, they have value in their cultures and their beliefs, but of course it's a different one. All cultures has a value as long as they respect human rights. That's the message of the International Declaration, the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity. And here this diversity enter into conflict through two different agrarian or production systems. So we have one system that is based on nature cycles, respecting the cycle of the nature themselves, working together with nature, and another system that try to create their own conditions of production. So in that sense, Pernilla, do we have the possibility to find common grounds for those systems to succeed when, of course, the resources are limited and when state authorities are pressured to support sustainable development for all? So take out from poverty all individuals, members of minorities, majorities in a country. And as we see, the people in that were characterized in the movie, all of them were living not precisely in very good health economic conditions. They were part of the more poor part of society, but clashing between each other because having different understanding. Can we find common ground, or is not possible? How do you see it? Don't forget the microphone, please.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. Actually, I think what is critical to find this common ground is that you have a power balance where all knowledge systems are equally valid. It's what we can call a multiple evidence base. Because you can see, for example, that in this case, Haritas, her culture has the local knowledge of this place, and she knows a lot about bees. And you also have the son, which start to get interest in her way of managing the bees. And actually, my impression is that if you had quite another situation, if we had a stronger community, if we had maintained the culture, the collective action of the people who lived in the community. I mean, we could found ways of those two cultures to benefit from one another, because you can also see lots of good positive instances when they are meeting, when they are eating together, when she's getting good contact with the kids. And And it's just that when they arrive, this example here is a culture that have, I mean, the collective action, the community strength, and the customers' sustainable use laws have, I mean, she's the one who is maintaining it, and there would have been so many more people. But just to mention a few examples, we have a relation with some Karen community in northern Thailand that are actually also working with wild bees and collecting their honey, and have this amazing deep knowledge of the culture. And there you have several communities where they have managed to organize themselves and get their forest back again after being threatened by exploitation and cutting of forest. The same we can say on the Oigic people in Kenya, for example. They have also won victories, although it's never easy, but you can both find when duty bearers as communities have managed to have victories, but they need to not be alone anymore. And here is maybe where we would find some way of state, because I'm also thinking about how many times the states are actually rather threatened the people. We have so many examples also of indigenous peoples that have been thrown out of their land by their own governments, with the argument that they will protect nature, when the situation is that they are rather the one protecting the nature. So there is where we come to, for example, the need to protect environmental rights defenders, which we are now within the CBD also taking in as part of what we can have as a human rights-based approach. As those are so important, their right to defend nature is so important for both nature and human beings. So it's like, I would say that, yes, there is opportunities to live together, but we need also to have then this power balance and the recognition of knowledge of different cultures and respect values together with that, and the need of land to maintain biodiversity. So you need to recognize resource rights and land rights together with all this. It's a bundle of rights.
Absolutely. I think that you are giving us a very good roadmap that I would like to explore together with Claudia. That is how to build bridges between the different communities in a society. So our main character, Hatitze, she's representative of a culture of a community that is facing extinction. People are leaving the community. It's just only her standing behind. But how to reinvigorate and appreciate the value and make sure that the rest of the society appreciate the value of that particular culture and the contribution that that particular culture gives to the entire society by providing better understanding of the richness of the culture. So in that sense, Claudia, you were mentioning that we can have models that are bottom-up models that could support the development of those traditional systems that are close to the environment. One of the possibilities, as Pernilla mentioned, is to support and give the right tools to environmental defenders, environmental human rights defenders. They could, and civil society, they could be the ones building bridges and making sure that minority cultures or indigenous people cultures get the right visibility and the right appreciation in the mainstream community. But do you think that that could be a way forward, or do you have something else in mind that could support the appreciation, respect, and sustainable development of these cultures that has been left behind?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there is definitely an increased awareness of the linkages between human rights, environment, biodiversity. I mean, when I started working with this issue 20 years ago, it was really seen as a fringe topic. And when I tried to explain what I was studying, what I was working with, it was quite difficult because it was not so much into the radar, not only of human rights lawyers, but also more broadly. Now you see the issue being discussed, not only among academic audiences, but also among policy practitioners, lawyers, civil society organizations. I think again here, bringing from sustainability science, a multi-level perspective. So we cannot be thinking only in terms of the very localized reality, because that reality is being affected by other regional, national trends. We see in the film that at the beginning, there is this exchange in terms of this traditional knowledge and how this can be done, the beekeeping, in a way that people benefit from nature, and at the same time, the bees can have a thriving life. And then when somebody from outside starts pressing this family to give more and more rapidly and so on, it's where the balance also gets more disturbed. But again, talking about these interlinkages approach between the local and the global, I think weaving the Convention of Biological Diversity, Article 8J, 10C, that are particular articles that refer to traditional knowledge, sustainable use, with international human rights law, that there's a huge jurisprudence in terms of indigenous peoples' rights. If you see, for example, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, especially in relation to Latin American indigenous people, there's a rich jurisprudence. So I think that's at the core of bringing these grounded solutions, but also building on international instruments. And just to give you an example where this was done. In Mexico, the Maya people have traditionally an ancestral knowledge about beekeeping. What happened there was distant because it was pesticides, toxic pesticides from soy production affecting their honey. So they went to court in Mexico, the national level, and the court agreed with the fact that they weren't consulted for the plantation of these modified soybeans that were affecting the, not only in terms of the honey, but they could also prove by engaging in collaboration with other civil society organizations, with UN organization as well, to prove that the impacts of this pesticide that was affecting the bees, that was affecting others, was also in terms of affecting a broader, even city people. So I think, again, this ecosystems approach and these interlinkages between the national, local, and global, and how to use law to affect this change. And I think thinking about environmental human rights defenders and women specifically as environmental human rights defenders in terms of not only people that go and manifest in the streets, which I think is very important and is in exercising the freedom of expression and peaceful association, but also people that are like the people we see practicing this traditional knowledge are also environmental human rights defenders. The people that go to court and represent, for example, these women that I was talking in terms of the Maya people, they are also environmental human rights defenders. So I think the concept of environmental human rights defenders, it's interesting, I think, to see it broadly.
Thank you, Claudia. And actually, we have one question coming from the public that is very much linked with what you have said. That is, how is it important? No, the first question was if Hatice would have gone to court, could that be possible? Would she have been able to have the court helping her? How could human rights help to settle the problem? So, of course, we are not talking about the inter-American system. Macedonia is in Europe. It's part of the European human rights system, anchored in the Council of Europe, and ultimately will be the European Court of Human Rights, the one deciding on a human rights case. And in that case, deciding on the interlinkages between environment and human rights. Of course, could have been also the Human Rights Committee in connection with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee on the right to take part on cultural life. So there are different avenues, but not always is clear how the outcome will be. Will you be able, just following up with your comments, Claudia, will you be able to say if that would have been possible in this case?
I think that in this case in particular, it could have been that couldn't be the right avenue to go. I think this other case that I was mentioning of the Maya people, it was because it was a big company that was affecting not only this very particular piece of land, but a broader area and so on. So I think it merited to go to that level because it was really to stop that from happening. It started being prohibited in one state of Mexico and then in others. So it was needed that level of intervention. I think for the case that we're seeing, I think it is much more about how do we create these relationships between people of respect, of understanding of their common human dignity, that again, it's at the core of the human rights-based approach, and find ways into which customary norms and so on allow them to interact in a way that it's respectful. And I think this balance that it has been highlighted before between people could have been a better way forward. I don't think personally that going to court could have been the best way forward for her. And I think you have other examples of, I was mentioning bioculture community protocols, where again, you need a collective to sit down and think, okay, what are our priorities? If an external comes, how are we gonna deal and how are we gonna respond to these threats? How are we going to relate with others in a respectful way, in a way that also allows us to continue fulfilling our human rights, interconnected human rights?
Thank you, Claudia. And actually, from the public, they were asking as well how to make sure that these communities are involved in those policy discussions and how to make sure that they are consulted and they have the participation that they deserve in order to their voice to be heard. So that's something to keep in mind. But also there is another question that I think Pernilla will help us to answer, that is in connection with Indigenous peoples. I know that you have been working closely with Indigenous communities in your career. And the question that is coming from the cinema, from Kino, is how important is the role of Indigenous peoples and how the role of Indigenous people could be highlighted in connection with the future of biodiversity. And I will add an additional element, how we can make sure to incorporate Indigenous people's knowledge, understanding, tradition when we discuss about sustainable development. Pernilla, what do you think?
Well, first of all, that Indigenous peoples and their traditional customer sustainable use are exceptionally important for protecting biodiversity, both because you have had this mutual interaction between them and nature. I mean, it's not only nature supporting them, they are also supporting nature. It's like a cosmovision that is very basic in most indigenous cultures. And also that if you look globally, actually most of the land that still is what we called natural forests and so on are inhabited by indigenous peoples. So what we call wilderness is for them, their cultural lands. And of course, they also, thanks to their customary laws and so on, are very much part of why these lands are maintained and why it is not like already logged or so on. So this means that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the recognition of indigenous rights to their lands and waters, the rights to self-determination, and the rights to the culture is, of course, very basic. I mean, it's also in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognized that they have the right to their genetic resources and the knowledge about it. And as I mentioned initially, that their knowledge is valued related to when they're practicing biodiversity, and you need to have land to take care of the biodiversity. So that is why it's so important to link them. And if you look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, it is a recognition to indigenous peoples. However, it is always with the reference to national laws. And here I think it's the same as with human rights law, that one thing is that we managed to agree on the international level of global convention and laws that is like sufficiently to protect people, but we are not at all so good in getting them implemented. The same that people need to know about them, and that is maybe also the challenge here in this case, that yes, they are completely left with themselves and their culture shocks and how to manage it. But I would really stress that indigenous peoples are critical for the protection of biodiversity, both concretely as manager of it, but also as environmental rights defenders.
Thank you very much, Pernilla. Actually, I fully agree with you, and I will say something more. I think when we discuss sustainable development from the perspective of state authorities that are responsible to carry out and implement the different goals that has been recognized by the international community or identified, I think we have a lot to learn from indigenous people's traditional knowledge. And that knowledge that has been developed through centuries in close contact with nature, especially in connection with those goals that are linked with sustainable environment. But here we have another question from the cinema, from the floor, that I would like both of you to address from your different perspectives. That is, what each individual, each of us sitting in this panel or sitting in the cinema, our friends, our acquaintances, what each of us can do in order to start with that change, in order to better contribute to biodiversity, how we can make a contribution for the protection of the environment, for the protection of biodiversity, from wherever we are as individuals. What we can recommend to our audiences that are listening to us today. What do you think, Pernilla? And then we come to Claudia.
I mean, first of all, it is important to not throw all responsibilities on the individuals, because we are part of structures and we cannot move the structure. But one thing I would say is to learn about nature, enjoy nature, take your kids, bring them to nature and have them to know about the beauty of forests, what are the animals there. Start also, if you have the opportunity, garden with them, show them the seeds, the beautiful variety, how things are growing. In the forest, you can teach them about the mushrooms. I think that what we can do is to bring this love and respect of nature, and also that biodiversity is everywhere. It's right outside your window. You don't need to go to an exotic place at other part of the world. And you also have local communities nearby. You have a farmer that is cultivating vegetables or well, apples or locally produced foods nearby. Visit them, buy the products, learn from them. I think this is like basically, I mean, in your daily life, and particularly, no, don't forget the kids and bring your love for nature to them.
Thank you very much for that. And I think the farmer that lives close to our summer house, Bror, will be very happy because you're recommended that we keep buying his potatoes, which are fantastic. So I recommend you to buy that kind of local products. And also to watch this film. I think that is also a way to generate that kind of knowledge that you are mentioning. But Claudia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's something that it's quite important is to think about our consumption patterns. The food we eat, where's it coming from? Where's the honey that you're eating, perhaps for your breakfast today, or your coffee? It's often coming from these countries that are quite diverse. So is it fair trade? Do you have a way to get to know where are these resources coming from? Are they supporting these agroforestry practices and biodiversity? I think that's a very concrete way to start in our daily life, to walk the talk. I think in terms of saying, I think many of the people joining us are based in Sweden. Well, Sweden has international development cooperation, and as part of the European Union also has specific commitments towards complying with its human rights obligations, biodiversity obligations. And as part of participating in this process, whether it is at the municipal, national, international level, we can be bringing these issues. We can't just sit down and expect that the state will be doing everything. If you're an academic with very specific knowledge about water-related issues, the example that I gave you in terms of how the water was being also contaminated, and that was the same source of pollution to honey. I mean, you can provide these expert witnesses in specific court cases. So I think it's asking ourselves, what is our positionality and where can we have a most effective intervention? We see children running social media campaigns and youth that are not only connecting between their local communities, but other communities, and then they are affecting really global change. So I really encourage you to be creative. The work at the international level is not more or less important. The work at the grassroots communities, again, is not more or less important. It's our collective interaction. It's our collective initiative that I think can make this a thriving world for everyone, including nature. Thanks, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Claudia and Pernilla. And I think these reflections, I think, are very important for all of us because we can be a part of the process of a change. We have great examples here coming from Sweden that we witness, for example, in the case of Tuberg. I'm apologize for my pronunciation, but every single person could, if he has a if he's committed to a particular idea, could make a change from wherever that person is. And of course, that could be to be part of a structure, to be part to further develop the knowledge that he or she has in order to make a change from that particular disciplinary angle. But as well as a element of a collective pressure or campaign that advocates for a particular cause. So I think in that sense, we have also a role to play as individuals, but also as part of a community. And films like the one that we have watched today help us to regain that consciousness that there are causes that we can embrace, there are causes that we can take into our heart and start working for them. So I would just like to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your thoughts with all of us, with the audience, Pernilla and Claudia, and to thank Christina and all the organizers for creating this space for discussion, for reflection, and for giving the chance to the public to ask, to put the questions, to reflect together with us in connection with how to contribute to biodiversity and how to save and further develop our wonderful diversity that we have in our marvelous world. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in this wonderful Swedish Human Rights Film Festival. Thanks a lot. Back to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, dear panel. It was a pleasure, and we are taking this with us over the weekend to go out in nature and enjoy and help protect. Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch soon again.